It is now 6:05, so we're going to get started. First, we'd just like to thank you for joining us this evening for the Cape Fear Wood Preserving Superfund Site Proposed Plan meeting. I'm Stephanie Brown. I'm the Community Involvement Coordinator here in Region 4, EPA. We just have a few housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. Just want to let all the participants know that the meeting is being transcribed and recorded. If you have a comment or you have a question after the presentation, you can use the raised hand icon or put your question in the chat, or we will, at the appropriate time, we will unmute you so that if you want to ask your question, you'll be able to do that. At this time, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Hillary Thornton, who is the Remedial Project Manager for the Cape Fear Wood Preserving Site.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that introduction and those ground rules. So my name is Hillary Thornton. I am the Remedial Project Manager or Cleanup Project Manager for the site. And I have a short presentation to go through with you all this evening to explain EPA's plan for completing the cleanup at the site, after which we'll entertain questions from the audience. So, Ms. Niles, if you would put up first slide and we'll get started. Thank you. Hope everyone can see that well. So this site is called the Cape Fear Wood Preserving Site. It is a Superfund site in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And this evening we are conducting a virtual public meeting to explain the proposed cleanup plan for the site. And our names are on this introductory slide along with our titles. So if you need to refer back to that later, you may. Next slide, please. So the goals of the presentation this evening are for us to discuss EPA's proposed cleanup plan for the contamination remaining beneath the site and to discuss opportunities for the community to participate in the remedy selection process. It's important for the community to understand that you do have a say in this cleanup process and this remedy selection. The remedy is our term of art for the cleanup that we will do at the site. Next slide, please. So community participation. Our proposed plan was published on August 12th, 2022 on EPA's website for the site, the Cape Fear Wood Preserving website. And we are now sort of in the middle of a 30-day public comment period that runs from that publication date of August 12th all the way through the 11th of September 2022. Interested parties can submit written comments by mail or email. And of course, you can also make a comment or ask a question on this evening's presentation, and as part of this meeting that will be recorded and transcribed, and we'll be able to include that in our responsiveness summary that is part of the amended record of decision. That's where we're kind of headed here with this process. And also wanted to mention that a number of key documents, including the proposed plan, are linked to on the site webpage and can be found at the Cumberland County Library, which is located at 300 Maiden Lane in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Next slide, please. So the main parts of EPA's proposed cleanup plan are the in situ solidification and stabilization of creosote waste, referred to in some of these documents as DNAPL, which it stands for dense, non-aqueous phase liquid. There are a lot of technical terms in the cleanup of hazardous waste, and I apologize for that. I've done my best in this presentation to minimize the use of those terms, but some of them seem unavoidable. So I'll try to explain them where I can, and if you have questions about anything that I've said, please ask them when we get to the question time, which is coming up soon. So we will also, after we do that solidification and stabilization of the creosote waste, we will construct a cap over the top of that treated area to prevent infiltration of rainwater or other water from the surface down over that solidified material. In the area out beyond where the creosote waste has been solidified, we'll inject oxygen underground, and that oxygen will feed the naturally existing bacteria and enhance the speed at which they break down any contaminants that are dissolved in the groundwater out beyond the solidification area. We'll perform long-term maintenance and monitoring, and we'll take actions necessary to prevent use of contaminated groundwater and to increase public awareness. Next slide, please. So a brief outline for the remainder of our presentation. I'll go right after this into a additional or enhanced description of the site, expanded description, and also a little bit about the site's history, just the high notes of that. There's a lot of history you can read about in the site files if you're interested. I'll talk about the focused feasibility study that EPA did to develop the options for this cleanup. I'll talk about the evaluation of those cleanup options. I'll summarize EPA's proposed cleanup plan, which is our favorite choice of combination of those different options. And I'll go on into the next steps. Next slide, please. So start off with the site description. The site's street address is 1219 South Riley Road in Fayetteville. You can see the red Google Maps pin next to that street address on the aerial photo at the right, kind of in the center, centered on that point. At that location, there was a creosote wood treatment plant that operated from the 1950s until the early 1980s, after which time a cleanup began. That cleanup is now ongoing. And at this point in 2022, only the groundwater contamination remains. The surface soil and any threats to the surface water and sediment, all of those have been cleaned up by earlier EPA actions. What's left is groundwater contamination beneath that red pin and these DNAPL material or creosote that is the ongoing source to further contamination of groundwater. So let's move on to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of the site. So as I was saying earlier, from 1953 to 1983, Cape Fear Wood Preserving operated on the site. As part of their operations, they dripped and spilled creosote and related wastes onto the ground. Those remained behind when their operation ceased in 1983. So from 1984 onward, EPA has performed a series of cleanup actions on the soil, sediment, surface water, and groundwater at the site. In 2012, EPA turned over the operation of the groundwater pump and treat system to our partners, the state of North Carolina, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And in 2022, EPA is back proposing an alternative cleanup plan for the contamination remaining on site. And we'll get into more details of that plan in the following slides. So let's go ahead. Next slide, please. So to prepare for today, EPA performed a focused feasibility study, and the goal of that focused feasibility study was to identify and compare various cleanup options that are capable of achieving the goals of the proposed cleanup plan. Next slide, please. So the goals of that plan that was looked at in the focused feasibility study are to prevent migration of contaminated groundwater, to eliminate or contain principal threat waste, which is the DNAPL I mentioned earlier that is in the groundwater, to restore the groundwater to drinking water standards, and to prevent the ingestion or drinking of contaminated groundwater. So these goals of the proposed cleanup plan are also sometimes referred to as the remedial action objectives, or RAOs, but hopefully for your better understanding, I've just referred to them here as the goals of the proposed cleanup plan. If you look at the full text of the proposed plan, you'll see these same goals referred to as the remedial action objectives. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering, especially if you live near the site, where the contamination is. So here's an aerial photograph figure that shows that 1219 South Riley Road address, looking down from above where the contamination is. The worst or most concentrated contamination is between 5 and 35 feet below ground surface in the areas outlined in red. That's referred to as the main source area, even though there are more than one of these red blobs on your screen, all of them together are the main source area. You can see that south one where the hand is now is labeled the south main source area. There are also 2 yellow outlines on the screen. Those are the secondary source areas. It's a lower or lesser amount of contamination in the soil underground at those areas. And you can see they sort of form a halo or an outline that is beyond where the red is. So the highest concentrations are in the red, the intermediate concentrations are in the yellow, and the least contaminated area has the dotted blue outline around it. And that forms, roughly a halo of dissolved groundwater contamination. That is the limits of where the contamination is at a level that needs a cleanup. We'll come back to a different version of this figure later on that shows the different cleanup technologies and approaches that EPA plans to use. But we wanted to, before we got any further, assure you that this is where the contamination is. And if you don't see your house on this figure, then there is not groundwater contamination from Cape Fear wood preserving beneath your property. So it's quite concentrated in this area right along South Riley Road, the railroad next to it, and the 1219 South Riley Road property. Next slide, please. So we looked at various cleanup options, and in the proposed plan document that's on the EPA's website, we identify 4 alternatives for further evaluation, kind of combining different technologies that would address all of the areas that I just talked about, the main source area, the secondary source area, and that dissolved plume outlined in the blue dotted line. Alternative 1 would have been a barrier wall and cap around the main and secondary source areas, followed by enhanced in situ bioremediation and monitored natural attenuation out in that dissolved plume area. So enhanced in situ bioremediation, that is a technology where we inject oxygen and sometimes a bacterial culture to feed naturally occurring bacteria to consume or digest these contaminants in the subsurface. So that helps that to happen. The enhanced refers to the injection of oxygen to accelerate that process. And the in situ just means in place, where the contamination is underground beneath the site. And bioremediation means using naturally occurring biological organisms, bacteria in this case, to consume the waste and render it harmless. So MNA, those 3 letters, that stands for monitored natural attenuation. And that's a less active form of allowing the natural bacteria and the natural flow of groundwater to attenuate or lessen the levels of the contamination that remain in the site, in the soil, in the groundwater beneath the site, rather, underground, as that groundwater is in between the individual soil particles. So alternative 2, highlighted in yellow because that is EPA's preferred alternative. And I guess before I entirely leave alternative 1, I should note the total cost line along the bottom here. So alternative 1 had by far the lowest cost of the 4 alternatives that we have evaluated. And the other 3 are fairly similar, 20, 21, 22 million dollars. These are in millions of dollars. So none of these alternatives is inexpensive, but protecting the health of the public is our agency's mission. And that's what we're here to do, protect human health and the environment. So let's talk a little bit about alternative 2. That calls for in situ solidification and stabilization, followed by a cap. And that in turn would be followed in that outer dissolved plume area by enhanced in situ bioremediation and monitored natural attenuation. So let me go back up and explain some of the terms that are new here in alternative 2. In situ, you know that means in place. Solidification or stabilization, that is a technology where we bring in heavy equipment and we stir in cement and other materials into the ground, mix them up with the ground and with the waste that's there beneath the ground. And that forms what we call a monolith, essentially a giant concrete block right there beneath the ground, beneath that site. And because it is captured within that solidified block, the contamination becomes stabilized, so that even if time passes and the years go by, sun shines down, it gets hot, it gets cold, summers and winters pass, groundwater flows by, the contaminants remain stabilized in that monolith. We put a cap over the top of that, which is an engineered multi-layer surface treatment. And that cap prevents rainwater and other surface water from getting down into the subsurface and trying to erode away the solidified and stabilized monolith. So that's an extra measure of protection to that solidified and stabilized monolith. And then for the outer dissolved plume, we have the same combination of technologies as in alternative 1. And in 2 and 3 and 4, they're all the same for the dissolved plume, the enhanced in situ bioremediation and monitored natural attenuation. So for alternative 3, we've proposed in situ thermal remediation, or evaluated it, we didn't propose it. What we're proposing is what's highlighted in yellow as alternative 2. But before we proposed that, we did evaluate different approaches. And another way that we could have handled this contamination in the subsurface, in the main and secondary source areas, would have been with in situ thermal remediation. And that would have been heating up the ground underneath the surface to thermally break down this creosote residue DNAPL that's beneath the site surface. We would have done that in the main source area. In the secondary source area, which when I was showing you earlier was outlined in yellow, we'd have done the same in situ solidification and stabilization that I just talked about for alternative 2, where we're proposing to do it for all of the source area, the main and secondary. In alternative 3, we would only have done that solidification process in the outer secondary source area. Again, the dissolved plume would be treated by enhanced in situ bio and M&A. Alternative 4, the last of all our alternatives, we talk about in situ smoldering, or the STAR process. That's a proprietary process whereby the subsurface is actually ignited and smolders. So it's, in essence, it is a thermal cleanup, but it's a particular type of in situ thermal cleanup that involves a controlled burning or smoldering of the subsurface, destroying the contamination in the main source area, and then the secondary source area and dissolved plume areas. The technologies would be the same as I discussed before. And you can see, again, I'll review the costs along the bottom. For alternative 1, the cost was just under $8 million. And for alternatives 2, 3, and 4, they're all fairly close to the $20 to $22 million range. 2, 3, and 4, they cost so much more because they're much more active. They involve going down into the subsurface with technological approaches that actually treat the contamination, solidifying it, stabilizing it, or thermally destroying it. Whereas alternative 1, just put a barrier wall around it. That would have been a containment option. So we've talked a lot about these different options on this slide. So let's go ahead to the next slide. And here we are with, as I promised before, another version of an aerial photograph of the site that this time shows and summarizes the proposed cleanup plan, these various different technologies that I was talking about in the earlier slide. So the in situ solidification and stabilization are the little green filled hexagons or circles that are shown around the red and within the yellow boundaries of the main and secondary source areas. And then for that dissolved plume area, you can see with the yellow well points with the blue, dark blue circles around them, where EPA is proposing to inject oxygen for the enhanced in situ bioremediation component. The purple rectangles along the road and the railroad are areas where it may be possible to treat the contaminated soil beneath South Riley Road and beneath the 2 railroad track lines there without removing those, without having to disturb the flow of traffic at the surface. If it's possible to do that, as we'll determine in design, that approach is preferred. If it is not possible to do it without disturbing them from the surface, and if we decide, if the design selected and completed by the EPA calls for it, we believe it will be possible to contain that material beneath the road and railroad using jet grouted barrier walls along either end. You can see at the ends of the purple bars, small lines that depict where those jet grouted barriers can be constructed. So I'd be happy to answer questions about that, put this back up if folks have questions about any of that later on during the Q&A period. For now, that's a quick summary of what EPA is proposing for construction of the remedy at this site. Let's go on to the next slide. So to give you an idea of what the next steps are, we are in the middle of this proposed plan 30-day comment period. So I'm here with you tonight to explain our plan, to answer your questions about it. And then you'll have until September 11th, 2022 to submit comments on EPA's plan. Then our schedule shows that we'll do by the end of September 2022, we will issue what we call an amended record of decision. A record of decision is the formal plan where EPA records for the public what we will do to clean up the site. And there has been a plan in place for this site. There is an existing cleanup plan called the remedy, and we got partway through doing that plan, and we determined that we needed to make a change or an amendment to the operating cleanup at the site. So that's why we're back with you tonight to propose an amended record of decision, a proposed plan that will be documented in an amended record of decision scheduled to be signed sometime towards the end of September 2022, after the public comment period ends and after the state and the public have had an opportunity to review and comment on EPA's proposed plan. After that, EPA, once we have an issued, signed, final amended record of decision, we enter a phase of the cleanup called the remedial design or the cleanup design. And during that time, shown on the slide as 2023, next year, we will be designing the cleanup. So we've done enough preliminary study to figure out approximately what this would cost, approximately where we would need to do the various elements or components of our cleanup plan, but we'll fine tune that in remedial design. EPA will hire an engineering firm to do a detailed design that will have all the specifics and all the information that a construction contractor would need to actually come out and construct this design, build it. So we'll have a finished design on paper scheduled by 2023. The following year, we anticipate actually getting in the field to construct this cleanup, this remedy. That's 2024. Of course, whether that happens in 2024, sooner or later, depends on all the steps coming before having been completed appropriately. So let's go to our next slide. So here on the screen are your site contacts. Up top, Hillary Thornton, that's me. I am the remedial or cleanup project manager for the EPA. It's my telephone number, my email address. Stephanie Brown, who you met as she opened the meeting, is EPA's Community Involvement Coordinator. For those of you who are in the community around the site, if you have questions of a non-technical nature, or you just are comfortable approaching Stephanie, she can always get to me. Here is her email address and telephone number. And the third name on the screen is my state counterpart with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, Beth Hartzell, and her contact information. So the federal EPA is what we call the lead agency for this site. North Carolina DEQ is our support agency, but Beth Hartzell and I work together closely on the management of the cleanup at the site. And we encourage you to reach out to anybody that you wish to. This proposed plan and ROD amendment process is a federal process of the EPA. So for comments on this proposed plan and thoughts about the amended ROD, Stephanie and I would be the best people to contact. But if you have questions about the site more generally or anything about the site's history, I'm sure Beth would be happy to entertain a question from you. So next slide, please. All right. Maybe we'll go to Stephanie to talk about the ground rules and the process for the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Hillary. As we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation, you do have an opportunity to comment on this proposed plan. The comment period is open and it closes on September 11th, as Hillary stated. You can make your comments either by sending an email to Hillary at the email address that was on the screen, or you can mail your comment in writing to the address that was there. I can't remember if the address was there, but if you need the address, please let us know and we'll make sure to get that to us. But you can also make your comment or ask any questions here tonight. The chat is open. We will unmute you if you want to ask your question verbally here tonight, but you can put your question or comment in the chat or use the raise hand icon and we'll acknowledge you and unmute you if you want to speak. Or again, you can email or mail your comments into Hillary. And at this time, I'm going to ask Laura Niles to unmute anyone who raises their hand or to monitor the chat so we'll see who has a question or comment tonight. Again, the presentation, this entire meeting is being transcribed for the record. We will respond to each comment in a responsiveness summary in the record of decision, within that record of decision. So I'm going to ask, if you do have a question, if you put your name in the chat, ask your question, and if you state your name, if you verbally ask your question tonight, because we do have a court reporter or a transcriptionist with us tonight who is transcribing and recording this meeting. So again, we'll just open it for questions at this time.
I see we have two call-in attendees. So if you wish to raise your hand, if you're calling in by phone, hit *9 so we can see that you have a question.
Thank you, Laura.
I don't currently see any questions in the chat.
Well, with that, I'm going to ask Laura if you can to go back to, if you're able to go back to the slide with the contact information on it.
Yes.
Thank you. So again, if you'd like to submit your question or comment in writing, Hillary's contact information is here. You can email him at the email address on the screen. Again, the comment period is open now and it will close at 11:59 on September 11th, 2022. all other information that you may need or additional information about the site is on our site webpage.
Just a comment in the chat, not a question.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay,
Thank you, Laura.
sure.
Well, Hillary, if you want to close us out, if
Just
there's
like
anything
to
additional you want to say.
Just like to thank everybody who's viewing this presentation, whether you're viewing it now live or whether you're joining later to view a recording of it. EPA values and welcomes your input on the process. I encourage you to read the materials and ask questions or make comments that you may have as part of the process at any time during the public comment period. So thank you for your attention and participation this evening. EPA values your input. Thank you so much. thank you, Stephanie and Laura, and for anyone else who is with us this evening who helped to make this possible. So you will be seeing more from the EPA in the coming weeks, months, and years as we continue the cleanup of the Cape Fear Wood Preserving Site. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. I will end the meeting now.